接下来进行下一场主题演讲。
Let's move on to the next speech.
本场演讲由维工商行有限公司的宋顺莲负责人担任主持人。
The speech will be moderated by Sunlian Song from MRS Microwork Company.
让我们欢迎宋负责人。
Let's welcome Mrs. Song.
Thank you. This is my time. I would like to introduce our new president of INWES, Dr. Sarah Pierce, to share the situation in Europe and North America regarding GISA. I think it's supposed to be a new gender index. Let's hear about that. And regarding Sarah, Sarah is currently president-elect of International Network of Women Engineers and Scientists. We call it INWES. So her term will start from next year, June 1st to 2026. Now she is the head of academic skill at New Model Institution for Technology and Engineering in England. As Dr. Kim keeping saying that Sarah will introduce the GISA project. So she used to be a GISA manager and then doing very deeply. And then today it is our another goal and the purpose to hear that from her. And Sarah's background is mathematics. So she including teaching qualification with a mechanical engineer PhD in the application of AI and reliable tools to maintenance of structure. So Sarah says she believes in global collaboration as the major way to improve the lives of women and men. Let's give a welcome to Sarah.
Hello and good afternoon to everybody at this event that's being hosted by Twist. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm Sarah Pierce. I'm incoming INWES president for the term 2024 to 26. And I was asked to talk about a particular project around the perceptions of gender barriers in science and engineering and to highlight some of the issues related to the EU and North America. So maybe I should start a little bit by talking about some background to gender and STEM. I mean, we know in the West that we have been concerned, particularly from the 1980s, around the lack of women in science, technology and engineering and maths, driven by the lack of engineers and scientists, so wanting to find more people to go into these areas, but also more lately driven by the understanding that we need diversity if we're going to have innovation. In the UK, the efforts to attract girls into science and engineering started back in 1984. The leaky pipeline, however, is a little bit more recent in terms of describing actually it's not just about getting girls into science and engineering and technology, but it's also about how do we prevent women from leaving STEM a little bit too early. We know that the issues are very different in all the different areas of STEM. So, for instance, in biology and medicine, we've got lots of women, young women in particular, but women still report barriers and glass ceilings. The United Nations reports only 30% of the world's researchers in STEM are women. And in engineering and digital technology, we still have huge gender gaps in the West here, in Europe and in the USA. I wanted to mention a little bit about me. I am, since 1992, I have been very much involved in the issues of gender and STEM, and since 2016 in INWES. I have been very much influenced by my own personal experiences, but also by my work, particularly my work around engineering skills and innovation. I'm currently head of academic skills for a new higher education institute in the United Kingdom, where I'm from. And that particular institution, the NMIT, the New Model Institute for Technology and Engineering, is particularly concerned about widening participation and making sure that there are more people of various different types, all genders, etc., at entering into engineering and technology. So the project I was that we were involved in at INWES was called Gender Barrier Perceptions in Science and Engineering. This was a project that was originally initiated by KWSC, the Korean Association of Women and Science and Engineering, but it also in the last 2 years involved INWES much more closely to try and take the project out to an international audience. This particular project has been funded by the South Korean government with the aim of comparing women in STEM situations in Korea with other countries. So it's been going on for quite a while, but in the last couple of years, as I said, it's gone international. So before I get started in talking about this project and the survey that was part of the project, I would like to maybe ask you a question. How do we know that we will have achieved gender equity at work, and particularly in STEM? Will that be when we have the same number of men and women in all job roles? Or will that be when gender has no impact on how you feel in your job role? We often, when we're talking about numbers, talk about the numbers of men and women. But that might be not the biggest issue. Remember what I've just finished saying about biology and medicine. Maybe the biggest issue is when we actually feel comfortable in our job, where we don't feel that gender is an issue. So that is maybe what we have to look for. So if I go on to say this is about perceptions, then perhaps the project name starts to make sense. So in the first year of the international study for perceptions of gender barriers in STEM, we ran this as a pilot study because we wanted to test to see how it would work internationally. And we kept it to a few sectors, so biology or the biological sciences, information technologies and digital, mechanical and civil engineering, purely to see how this would work. And we had a relatively small target that we needed to achieve. For the second year of the international survey, that was the 2022 study, we continued with exactly the same framework, but this time we included all areas of STEM, including medicine, social sciences, health, agriculture, mathematics, architecture, all the areas of engineering, etc. We had noticed also as well that in 2021 there were there were obviously areas which were hard to reach, particularly in Africa. So in 2022 we were looking to see how could we try and ensure that we had better reach in some of those areas. We also sought to collaborate with groups outside INWES, and one of the key things that we were wishing to do, and which I'll be talking about later on in a moment, is developing an index to measure progress of gender equality in STEM. And as you can see, the targets and numbers were larger, and we did manage to achieve all those targets. To give you all a better sense of the study and the survey itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about the questionnaire. Now, this questionnaire was open to both men and women. It was important that we found out what men thought about the barriers that women faced, as well as asking women themselves. This was a questionnaire that was based on the questionnaire that KWSC produced for 2018. We made some modifications, but very minor modifications to the key sections. It was section A where we made most modifications because we wanted to because we were looking at lots of different regions. But the key sections here to explain to you were the sections C and D. They were equivalent, except section C were intended for women or people who identified as women to talk about what they had actually experienced, while section D was for men or people who identified as men about the barriers that they had seen women experience. So that was the direct versus indirect. Section F was rather interesting because that was about the gender roles in society, and we added a new section, section H, which is about the respondents' own view of their own STEM career. All the responses were on the Likert scale, i.e. from 1 to 5, where 1 meant strongly agree or had experienced, and 5 was strongly disagreed or had not experienced at all. I mentioned section A earlier. That was quite extensive. There were lots of different things to consider, particularly the confounding variables that might have an impact on the validity of the statistical analysis. We delivered the survey as a Google form. We wanted to make sure that we made use of technology, but in addition, the Google form was a very deliberate choice because Google Forms don't let you identify where the respondent is, and that was very important to us, that it should be completely anonymous because of data protection regulations in certain countries, particularly Europe and Canada. I mentioned the STEM sectors, and in the 2021 pilot study, as I mentioned before, there was just the 3 STEM clusters, i.e. biosciences, engineering, civil and mechanical, and then computing and information technology. In 2022, however, we obviously needed to look at a sensible classification of all the different STEM areas. So we made use of a UNESCO classification as used in the SAGA toolkit. But we did have to cluster that as well to ensure that we could have sensible numbers to be able to analyse. You'll see from this table of target and the achieved numbers that we managed to reach many more countries, and we also achieved a reasonable number of responses. You can see on the map where particularly where it's dark green, the countries where we had the greatest number of responses. And the balance achieved was also good in terms of female and male, and all the STEM areas were actually reached as well. One of the things that concerned us in the pilot study was whether or not 1,200, as we had in the pilot study, or even for the 2022 study, whether or not the numbers we were receiving would be large enough to be able to carry out any statistical analysis. So that led us to consider sample sizes and to look for total numbers of engineers and scientists across the world. Now, later on, this might become a little bit more clear as to why I'm emphasizing this, but the only figures we could get where we could actually compare across the world was a perception index, or a perception of availability index, which was used by the World Bank as part of their Global Competitiveness Index. And that's essentially an index that was created by asking companies and asking experts whether or not they felt that in their country, in their region, they had enough availability of scientists and engineers. So this wasn't a number as such, it was just asking for perception. So you will, in a moment, I'll come back to this and explain why this is sort of relevant. To reach as many people as possible, we used, as we had in the pilot study, volunteers from around INWES, and also the INWES networks themselves, the regional networks, making sure that the survey was sent out to local contacts, to extended networks, extended groups. Because of the issue around hard-to-reach areas for Africa, we tried a local consultant, and he was very successful at reaching some of those hard-to-reach areas. So we were very pleased with that. Lots of social media, Twitter as well as Facebook, LinkedIn, conferences and events made sure we talked about the survey, and we varied the use of messages and QR codes and so on. Well, what were the outputs and the outcomes from this study? The statistical analysis compared responses of groups. We compared by gender across all the regions. We compared by STEM areas of focus. Because, of course, Korea was funding this particular work, we compared the Republic of Korea against all other countries. And we would have liked to have carried out even more analyses and lots of other comparisons, but these were the ones that were the key analyses. What we were doing was asking ourselves, are the comparison groups in agreement or are they in disagreement? Are they similar or are they very dissimilar? Particularly when it came to perceptions of, or in specific when it came to perceptions of gender barriers. So the statistical analysis we were carrying out was essentially t-tests for two-way comparisons. If anybody knows anything about statistics, that's what we were applying, and where we were trying to carry out 3 or more way comparisons. So, for example, trying to compare across all the different areas, the clusters of STEM, then we were using standard techniques such as ANOVA and so on. We did actually have to make use of extended techniques where the assumptions of the data conditions were not validated, but what we found was that the conclusions remained the same, which it showed that there was quite a lot of robustness to the analysis. For the 2021 pilot study, when I was reporting on this, I jokingly referred to the global war of the sexes in the sense that when we did a comparison of all men versus all women who responded to the survey, we saw that there were certain statements where there were strong disagreements. So, for example, under H, the statement from section H, which was about careers, personal careers, the statement, I have not been personally affected by gender barriers in STEM, men agreed quite strongly with that, while women tended to disagree. And so that was one of the biggest areas of disagreements. The other 2 statements, G5 and G2, coming from the section which was related to perceptions of gender barriers at work and study. So women tended to disagree as well with those statements, while men tended to believe that, to agree with those statements. At the other end of the scale, E3, which is was around policies. The statement, it is appropriate to introduce a quota system of affirmative action to solve gender inequalities in the STEM field. Women tended to agree with that, while men tended to disagree quite strongly. So that was so those were the areas of contention. And the statistical analysis showed that this was distinctly different between men and women. So still on the pilot study of 2021, we were also able to do a quick bit of analysis around the 3 STEM areas of focus, i.e. the bioscience versus the engineers versus the digital technologists. And we spotted that the bioscientists were much more likely to disagree with these 3 statements than the other 2 STEM sectors. And that would indicate greater gender barriers or greater perceptions of gender barriers, which might come as a shock to engineering women who often feel that if only there were more women in engineering, a lot of the gender barriers would disappear. Other notable results for the pilot study were also highlighted. And for example, here for Europe and gender, i.e. comparing responses from men in Europe and women in Europe, we noticed some contention around that statement where women were more likely to say that women in STEM do not receive equal work distribution and equal work appraisals compared to men. And that's sort of indicative that perhaps, although there's quite a lot of gender equity in Europe, there's still quite a lot of work to be done there. So a few more notable results. So for Europe, where we did an analysis for the STEM areas of focus, i.e. comparing everybody in Europe who was a bioscientist against everybody in Europe who was an IT professional versus engineers, we noticed that particularly for F3, which is section F, which was about gender roles in society, that IT professionals tended to be slightly less likely to disagree with that statement, i.e. indicating that they were more conservative. They probably felt that there should be gender roles in society. And then if we look to the very last notable result, and comparing the direct experiences of women and the indirect experiences of men, then across nearly all sectors and areas, women were more likely to report negative experiences more often than men would report seeing or hearing those negative experiences. So yes, strongly indicating that there was a STEM war of the sexes. It did continue. In 2022, the data analysis that we carried out was a little bit more extensive, and we were seeking to look at all the different STEM clusters, of course. We also looked at all the countries and regions which had more than 100 responses versus the rest of the world. We did try to do some work around analysing Francophone versus Anglophone Africa responses, but that didn't result in much differences. So that was in itself very interesting. And we were also looking at career stages and never leaving STEM. And we also carried out a lot of work around a robust GISA index, which I'll come to in a moment. Again, the global war of the sexes continued in 2022. We noted even a greater number of statements where there were high disagreements, including the statements that appeared in 2021. Now, that was, in one sense, that was good because that was showing that the survey was robust and the statistical analyses were also robust. However, it's still very sad that we didn't see that was an error in 2021. The statements around direct and indirect experiences, i.e. sections C and D, were the ones that were probably the most contentious, i.e. women were really reporting that they felt disadvantaged, while men were saying that they were not aware that women were disadvantaged. And still at the other end of the scale, women were still much more likely than men to agree that quota systems, affirmative action, strong policies were necessary. Sadly, one of the very strongest areas of disagreement was around the statement E1, I believe things will turn out fine in the future career for women in STEM. That was also a key point of disagreement between men and women. Women were much less hopeful, which is extremely sad when you think of it in its strong. The other element of analysis that we carried out was we were looking at Human Development Index and the Gender Inequality Index. So we looked at, we clustered countries and regions according to their levels of index and the four groupings, i.e. very high, high, medium and low. What we noticed was actually That both HDI and GII were very closely related, so we didn't have to really analyze them separately. And also very high and high were almost indistinguishable, and then very medium and low were also indistinguishable. So essentially, those four categories became just two categories. The exceptions were where we noticed quite big differences across the 4 different areas of HDI are noted there below. So let me go back to the question, that focus that we had right at the beginning, which was, this is, can we talk about the EU and Northern Americas? So are there far fewer gender barriers for women in STEM in the West and Global North? Does Europe and the USA, Canada do better than the rest of the world? These are key questions, because I think in the West there is a tendency to feel or to believe that that we can teach the rest of the world, particularly around gender and STEM. So that's a big question, and as I indicated, perhaps in the West we have been thinking about gender and STEM for a bit longer. Have we learned anything? Have we got a different situation to the rest of the world? Well, let's look at that in a little bit more detail. If we consider the status of women generally, and try to compare, say, for example, Taiwan with parts of the West, for example, Europe, then women in the workforce in Taiwan, it's much fewer women in the workforce than there are, say, in Europe, and indeed in the US as well, which are similar numbers. However, politically, you're much stronger here in Taiwan. So there are many more women in as elected politicians in Taiwan. 40% of your elected representatives approximately are women, while in the USA it's only 27%, and in the UK and Europe it varies across Europe, but it's not that much better in general. So maybe our gender inequalities are embedded. Maybe there isn't, we're winning here in the West when it comes to women in workforce, but in Taiwan you're winning when it comes to political power. And what about in STEM? Well, if we look at the percentage of STEM graduates who are women, well, actually, those numbers are extremely similar. Taiwan seems to be slightly higher, but the US, and these are figures from 2019 and 2021 for the US and Europe. But you notice US and Europe, it's 35% of STEM graduates are women. Be aware that that will include women in the biological sciences, or rather the graduates from biological sciences, and those, of course, are heavily feminized, i.e. in the UK, for example, probably about 70% of biology students are women. So we have to bear in mind that those figures, although averages across all areas of STEM, what we really should be doing is looking at individual areas of STEM and noticing the big gaps in some areas of STEM. So, but those numbers don't look that bad, do they? I mean, it's sort of coming up to 40%. So we're not that far off parity, are we? And I've just mentioned biology and medicine in the West, where there's so many women in these areas, where we've gone beyond parity, we've gone beyond 50%. But what's really concerning in Europe and in the US is what's known as the leaky pipeline. And that analogy is also described in Taiwan, and is also of great concern to the Taiwanese government and policymakers. So the leaky pipeline being where women leave STEM at a higher rate than men. So what we are still seeing is glass ceilings all the way around in STEM, and in fact, we still see big gaps in some areas of STEM at university level, but when it comes to the vocational levels, as in the technicians, the gaps can be much, much greater as well. So that is really concerning when we think about, whether or not we have gender equity. But can perceptions tell us more than this, particularly when we look at these figures where it's showing that Taiwan, the US and Europe all seem to have similar numbers and maybe similar issues? Well, I think that's what we're coming to. We think that perceptions tell us more than raw numbers. But of course, we do want to have a metric for perceptions as well. So that's led us to talk about a proposed gender index for STEM, which is one of the outputs from the GISA project. One of the hoped for aims was to identify a way to compare the gender and STEM situation in different countries or sectors. So I mentioned very early on the World Economic Forum's availability of scientists and engineers measure, which was really a perception measure. And remember, right at the beginning, I talked about how will we know that we have achieved equity at work. It's through how we feel at work, whether or not we feel that gender has no impact on our work and how we're perceived at work as well. So the perceptions of gender barriers in STEM are equally valid from the GISA report. We should be using those to propose a metric that tells us something about whether or not we have gender equity. So in particular, if very few people perceive barriers, then we have gender equity. But let's consider all the cases that we might have. So if we're comparing perceptions, so for example, if we know that men and women disagree in their perceptions of barriers, then we think there is a potential problem. Why? Because of course we do have glass ceilings, and that means that men tend to be in charge, and of course that means that men, if people in charge don't see problems, then how are we going to solve problems? But it might be that men and women do not disagree. Either they agree that there are barriers, and that means then we have a potential to overcome those issues, or they both perceive that there are no barriers. In which case maybe we do have equity. So combining these two elements, the disagreement between men and women and whether or not they don't disagree, we can then come up with an index that will tell us whether or not we have a potential progress towards gender equality. So the 2022 GISA study included quite a lot of work on developing a GISA index for STEM. So we carried out a factor analysis to reduce the number of variables, and we made use of the OECD Good Practice Guide on developing metrics. The two factors that we came to was a comparative factor, so that's the bottom factor there, the difference between genders. Were men and women disagreeing? If they were, then that was something to note. And then the other factor was the views of gender, and we were just looking there at absolute. We weren't comparing, we were just wondering whether or not women in particular actually perceived barriers or not. And so it was that combination of the two. If women did not perceive barriers, then we felt that there was a potential for gender equity because they're not reporting barriers. However, on the other hand, if there were reported differences of opinion, then that in itself was an indication of the lack of potential for progress. So the GISA index process involved quite a lot of work around recoding for consistency. We had those absolute views of gender, and then the comparative difference. Where these exist, there is a lack of potential for gender equity. And then we computed the average of the factors and we ranked them. So the GISA index gave you either a 0 for the lowest ranked country or region with least potential progress, up to 1 for highest ranked country or region with best potential for progress due to common awareness of gender barriers. It didn't have to be ranking versus by country. It could be by STEM sector, but in this case we stopped at country because we were still testing out this process. So these are some of the sample results of the GISA index during 2022. And you notice the African GISA index was 0, meaning the least likely or least potential for gender equity in STEM at the moment, while South America seemed to have the highest gender index for STEM. But what about Taiwan and, say, the European Union? So Taiwan actually came out quite low both in terms of the absolute. So women were reporting in Taiwan that they felt there were gender barriers, and there was actually a disparity between the perception of men and women about gender barriers in STEM. For the European Union, it was a slightly different situation. You'll notice that women tended to not report that many gender barriers, that 0.95 for the factor 1. So the factor 1 order of 7, meaning quite high in the list of potential for gender equity. However, European men tended to disagree with European women about the level of those gender barriers. So that pulls the GISA index for European Union down. So this is why we felt this was getting to be quite a rich index and a rich metric, because here we can see that women in Europe do feel that they generally don't have too many gender barriers, but men just don't perceive even the few gender barriers that there are, and that could be a barrier to progress, to further progress. I'd like to start wrapping up my talk by just explaining that if you wanted to know a little bit more about this report, there were many reports that came out, wonderful reports that came out from KWSC. So that those 4 are the 4 key reports from 2014 up to for the surveys from 2014 up to 2018. And then for INWES itself and the work that we carried out in the last 2 years, you will also find the reports for those on the INWES website. They're quite big reports, and I'm very happy to share them with you all. Please do have a look. One of the things that we want to do in the future is to create a community of practice around gender and STEM, and to carry out further work on further surveys and further analyses, particularly for specific sectors, but also taking this survey to regions that might want to spend much more time and much more detail, and having a very extensive study of their own region and the STEM sectors in their region. We hope that this GISA index will be one of the ways in which we can put a number to perceptions and then really make a difference towards gender equity across the world. This is very important for the whole world, because we know that diversity and inclusion lead to innovation, better science, fairer governance, and much better performing business. So as a way to engage with companies and partners out there, there's nothing better than to say we do need to change the world and make sure there's better gender equality in STEM. I'd like to finish now completely by talking about, following on from Professor Kim's talk about the impact that INWES has made in the past few years. We want to continue being impactful, and I'm putting down here some of the things that we intend to do, I hope that we intend to do over the next 3 years. Knowledge sharing, most important. We want to continue developing our regional networks. We want to create more. We've had lots of wonderful events and webinars recently. We want to continue doing that work so that we can share where policies and initiatives have worked or not worked, etc. The voice of women in numbers, as Professor Kim says, to be heard, you have to actually give evidence. So the GISA index, the GISA surveys, but in addition to those, we also want to do much more about raising the profile of women, general women in STEM, ordinary women in STEM, to show the work that we do, to show how important gender equity and gender equality in STEM is. Programs for future women in STEM was another category that Professor Kim highlighted. We want to carry out a focus on youth empowerment with collaborations and partnerships, and really strengthening the student groups around the world. So there have been lots of work around APNN and student and youth groups, and we want to continue with those and take those to the rest of the world. Finally, in the bottom of this, I'm proposing that we really need to work on resourcing and strengthening INWES so that we can have funds for capacity building for around the world. And finally, Professor Kim mentioned INWES and INWES 20, so I'd like to emphasize this again. The INWES 20 in the Philippines, September 2026. INWES is such an important event for all members of INWES and beyond as well. The theme for 2026 will be the Global Women in STEM, Building Her Story of an Inclusive World, hosted by the Philippine Women Engineers and Scientists, one of the INWES members. And there is already a website. It's still slightly empty, etc. But there's already dates in there. The Philippines look lovely, so I really hope to see lots of you there. Thank you very much indeed. So as I said, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank, obviously, the funders and initiators of the GISA projects, and to you all today. Please do join us at inwes.org. I'm Sarah Peers, and thank you so much to Anya Lin again, and to Shanyalin Singh and Dr. Fan and all the other organisers of today's event.
Thank you, Sarah. Now this is a question time. So there is a QR code you can scan, and we already collect several questions in the Slido. Can somebody show the Slido? Yeah. And actually, first question is from me, because you just mentioned that on the top question, everybody can see, the GISA index seems like perspective-oriented. And then can it be compared with GII, Gender Inequality Index you mentioned in your slide, and then GGI? Because when we see that the GISA index number, Taiwan number, it is very low, ranking low, compared to GII and then GGI. These two numbers, actually Taiwan is much high in the high ranking than Japan and Korea. However, the GISA index does not showing in that way. It is much behind Korea and Japan. So that just a little bit questioned, and then can it be compared? And then, because it is perspective, I am just wondering whether this perspective is a real world feeling. Okay, so that, yes, on the GII and the GGI, that is very scientifically data collection, and that was collected from big data. So whether that is, and you also mentioned Taiwan political issue and the women the percentage is much higher. That's true. That is why we have a high score in GII and then GGI. And then, so this is my question, whether GISA index can represent real world feeling or real world. It is not data, it is that data, yeah, real world data. So how can we define GISA index? This is my question.
I think that's an excellent question, Shenlian. So thank you so much for asking that. And I have to say that is a question that I asked myself a lot right at the beginning of the project, and I'll continue to be asking that, because as scientists and engineers, we tend to prefer hard data and hard facts rather than perceptions and feelings, etc. But I think the point I was trying to make in my presentation about listen, the World Bank and World Economic Forum make use of perception data to try and decide how innovative or what the capacity and capability is for a country to be innovative. To my mind, if somebody who is an organization who is concerned about money is interested in perceptions, then maybe we as women scientists and engineers should also be concerned about perceptions. And you're quite right. I think, can we compare it? Well, first of all, remember that the GISA index numbers that I've shown as the sample are not based on big data, not really. It's only just under 3,000 responses. There was many more than 3,000 responses, but we had to clean up the number of responses from the survey. So it can't be sort of wholly accurate, but not only that, it is a comparative index. So in a particular survey, if you take, so for example, for that GISA index, we had those 8 different regions and countries. We were comparing only those 8 different regions and countries. We were not comparing across all regions and countries, if that makes sense. So then they're not definitive values for the index. If we did a survey which was just comparing Taiwan with Africa, for example, then Taiwan would have come out at 1 and Africa would have come out at 0, I imagine, given those results. So this is a comparative index. I think the next piece of work is, how do we use this as a comparative index across the world? Is there something that we can do to go from comparative to something a little bit more, I'm trying to think of the word for non-comparative, a bit more definitive in the way that the 2 gender indices are. And then going back to the gender indices, the GII and the GGI, they are, when you look at them, there is nothing very specific about STEM in them. So there's a lot around work and health and knowledge, etc. But so the STEM element is very much embedded right at the bottom of all of that. So maybe if I go back to you raised the point I made about Taiwan and Taiwan having better representation of women in politics. So my question back to you would be, there's a hard fact, there's 40% of your elected politicians are women, but does Taiwan feel a comfortable place for women in STEM yet? And I'm going to suggest that maybe not, and that's why TWIST exists. And if you know, so the hard facts are part of the question. The other part of the question is, how do we actually feel ourselves? Now, I actually think that an index based on perceptions will be quite conservative, because we tend not to notice those biases and barriers that we individually face, particularly when we are new to our job, new to our sector. It's only much later, we have seen this at INWES and many of the women in STEM organizations, that the women who really want to drive the change are women who've been in the sector in STEM for many years and have started to spot patterns. So we're not very good at spotting patterns around biases early on. I think Paul made lots of comments on this around how it is very difficult for us to actually understand where there's a bias. So I would suggest that a perception index is actually a very conservative index indeed. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that helps, because you figure out, you just pointed out that is for science and SE field, science and engineering field. So GII and GGI, that is in general. Yes, you are correct. So I think that this is a major difference. So thank you for your point out the point. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
thank you for the question. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Pierce, I would like to ask the second question from the audience. They are curious about what would you suggest is the priority or priorities for INWES for the upcoming few years. And I myself would like to also ask if this priority being impacted by the study, by this study.
That's a good question. So the priorities generally, I feel, and of course I'm, we're a democratic organization. So this is something that I will be taking back to the board and to INWES members. But I feel that one of the strongest things that we should continue to do is probably around the knowledge share and the networking. So we are a global organization. We do have, amazing members who are very active there in their countries, and we are beginning to share the practices, the policies, the activities, and the programs that members are doing. But we're still not quite there. Global communication even in your own language, in your own country, with your own people is very difficult. Global communication is even harder. So we want to, I feel that we need to be doing much more about sharing the programs and activities that seem to work. So that's my top priority generally for INWES. Now you asked me, has this been influenced by this project? Not directly, other than one of the interesting elements about the GISA project has been how difficult it has been to communicate the GISA project, and it's also been we've also found that we have had certain groups telling us that some of the questions are not valid for them, and that tells me that maybe we have to, when actually I felt that they were very valid, it's just that we needed to communicate why we were asking those questions. So we needed to do much better around communication. I think the GISA index is more about external communication, explaining to policymakers, combined with the facts, combined with the hard numbers, why there are issues and why it is that some of those numbers are not shifting. Because where you see men in power and not noticing biases when women are reporting biases, then I think that is why numbers aren't shifting. So I guess there's two priorities at the moment. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Oh, Shanyan, I think you're mute. I can't cast.
Yes, next, on the top, the question is showed, would the accessibility of gender equality information in different countries affect the results of the survey?
That's interesting. Yes, I guess, yes, it might do, in the sense that if people understand, Paul Walton made that interesting point about the sort of different stages of awareness from I don't think there's any issue up to, I'm fully on board with trying to deal with some of the diversity issues. And by the way, I'd take this out broad. I would say there's gender, but there's also all sorts of other diversity issues. It's just that gender is very obvious because we're 50% of the world and we're not represented fairly in 50% of the world. So So I'm sure that if we had better information in all our countries, in all the regions, about the real facts, then some of that shifting from there is no issue to actually there is an issue. So some of those facts that Paul gave were very powerful. I think many people commented on how touching that speech was, that talk was, because it really brought out all sorts of issues that are sometimes very hidden. So the GISA index and the GISA survey is very much about saying, is very much about trying to identify where there may be an issue, and where if we can go to those areas and find the hard facts, because of course no research is carried out until somebody points out that there is a need for that research. So there is an element of two things, both. If there is some awareness already in that region or country, then it probably will affect the results of the survey, because people will have changed their own views and their own perceptions. They're either notice issues or, be already trying to deal with those issues. And then secondly, the GISA index and the survey can also drive the accessibility of gender equality information by driving the need to find out more. Yeah. Thank you for that question as well.
Yes, it's really a gender awareness issue. Yes. Then we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, we do. We do.
So I think last question, leave to the Dr. Fan.
Okay, I would like to ask the last question from the audience about in a study that shows bioscientists seem to hold quite different viewpoints other than the other group. And this is also, in fact, the study that we have conducted in Taiwan shows the same result. And in your viewpoint, what caused that? Bioscientists, how come they become quite different in our STEM field?
I suspect this is to do with, again, these are my own perceptions and my own views. So, I can't necessarily, you probably have better facts than I have to then inform your own perceptions and views. So I suspect that is because as a country, as many other countries, we're not yet at the place where both men and women are viewed equally competently for all sorts of areas. So I suspect that in the area of politics, there has been a lot of work to try and increase representation, while in STEM, not yet. And as Paul Bolton showed, thank you, Paul. That was an excellent talk with all those hard facts. Us scientists and engineers love those hard facts. As Paul explained, we globally we tend to underestimate the competency of women, particularly around the hard sciences, etc. So that is probably why in Taiwan you have got relatively good political representation, but not so good STEM representation in the workforce. It's a very similar situation to the UK and the USA and the West generally, in that, well, I think in the UK we tend to feel that we have quite a good level of gender equity, and in fact the sort of the two gender indices tend to show that we're not the best, but we're not too far off. So people often assume that women in STEM is not a big issue, when it's still a huge issue for these regions. We have a reasonable, not as good as Taiwan, a reasonable number of women politicians and women in power in that sense. But we still struggle in certain areas. And I think that's because gender equity is not there yet, basically. I hope that helps. Yeah.
And we still have 3 minutes, but Sarah, actually, I listened to GISA report this time, the third time. I really understand what is GISA influences that. So the last question here comes that the bioscientists disagree more with this statement than engineers. And then digital technology. Do you explore why bioscientists seems to be different?
Okay, well, I pointed out that particular difference because in my I'm not going to answer that question exactly. I'm going to answer slightly different questions, so bear with me. In my very early career, and probably up to about 20 years ago, whenever I worked with women in STEM, they would talk about if only there were more women in engineering. The women engineers would say, if we had more women engineers, everything would be okay. So I was very much influenced by that. And a lot of the arguments were, how do we increase the number of women in engineering? Now, what I was trying to point out there was there are a lot of women in the biosciences. I think this is true also in Asia. You do have many more women in the biosciences than you do in engineering and technology and the digital technology. But the women are still reporting gender barriers, and they're still reporting difficulties. And we still see, if we look at the hard facts, a huge amount of glass ceilings still in place for women in biosciences. So it's not just the numbers, there's something else. So I can't answer that. That's part of that. So the GISA survey should provide us with that reason for going to find out more.
Thank you, your conclusion. And then it is very good. We have more communication, then we have more understanding. I have so many, I am very good. I'm very happy to have this communication, and then I finally understand what is a GISA can use for. And then our time is up, and then pass to our announce.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
感谢莎拉·皮尔斯顿理事长的分享。
Thank you, President-elect Pierce, for your inspiring talk.